Hi, everybody. It's the last Saturday of March 2022, and welcome to the very first episode of what is tentatively being named The Weekly, a nice, casual, and humble name for a casual and humble broadcast. If you're listening to this, then you're probably somebody that I know, or at least that's the intention, so that is the context of how I'm going to be approaching this broadcast. Of course, you can write into me directly or leave a comment using an anonymous account with questions, comments, advice, information, topic requests, any of that good stuff. The plan is to have one or two other regular hosts and also have whatever guests on as well. For this first broadcast, it's just me basically running a practice round, test the sound quality and everything, and taking the opportunity to try to lay out a good surface level overview of my outlook on the current state of affairs. And if I don't get too sidetracked, maybe I'll even get a little bit into what I think there is to be done about it. I'm not exactly sure how long I want these podcasts to be. Maybe an hour. I won't, hold myself to try to fill the hour on this first one. And once we get multiple people in conversation, an hour can go by pretty quickly. But I have just a couple of point form notes in front of me that I will try to get through, and I have no idea, how what I'll be at in terms of time at the end of it. So I'll kind of have to play it a little bit by ear. So hopefully it doesn't lead to an awkward ending at the end of the broadcast. So I wanted to start by talking about cycles. Everything around us runs in cycles. The planet has its cycles, the sun has its cycles. You can even think of our weeks and years as being two levels of artificial cycles, with smaller cycles embedded within the bigger ones. Now, one of the most prominent public figures talking about some big picture cycles right now that society runs on is Ray Dalio, who is a very successful money manager and most recently wrote a book called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. If you look up Ray Dalio on YouTube, there is a 45-minute video summarizing the ideas of the book, and I'll give you an even more brief summary here. So, my sister actually bought me a copy of this book for my birthday. Um, and the idea is that empires rise and fall for similar economic reasons. They gain power through whatever means, then they consolidate power through systems and institutions, then they continue power through some method of succession. Then they can use their power to further benefit itself, such as instituting its own currency as the world reserve currency. But the result he describes is basically the same idea as what is called the Triffin dilemma, which you can look up, which outlines why maintaining a world reserve currency requires constant deficit spending and debt monetization, which in a nutshell basically means that the country leaks its real economic potential until a threshold is reached and there's a new top dog empire. One of the things he talks about is how after the Dutch mastered shipbuilding, the British could buy the superior designs and hire the designers while hiring cheaper British workers, allowing the British ships to be more competitive, which is kind of reminiscent of how the West today has outsourced much of its manufacturing. So you can kind of think of this outsourcing as a opportunity that is given to the underdogs to catch up with those who are ahead. Um, yeah, so it's kind of like a power equalization that arises from the fact that the more powerful party has to incentivize the lesser party to participate in its system. Otherwise, you just have to have constant war, and then you reach imperial overreach much faster. So I think the problem with Ray Dalio's model of these cycles is that the input data is too narrow and simplified. I mean, first of all, he only looks at the last 500 years of Western history, which is contextualized by the culture, the era, and the decisions on how societies should be run. You look at the Dutch, British, and American world orders, and you're looking at three societies which have as its substratum, so the underlying layer of it is a Protestant culture of individual liberty and responsibility. Ray Dalio's model takes a completely neutral view on individual liberty, human suffering, and the pitfalls of centralized planning. I mean, these are key questions that define a civilization, Um, and it characterizes the main political cultural differences between the current neoliberal order, sometimes also referred to as global homo, and the Chinese Communist Party. What we're seeing isn't just your run of the mill, once in a century handoff to a different referee for free commerce, like Ray Dalio makes it seem like. He makes it seem like, the American empire is declining, the Chinese empire is, on the rise. The Chinese empire will, inevitably take over the American empire, and, it'll be just business as usual, and we just wait for the next cycle. I think that that is not a correct way of looking at the current geopolitical situation and our position in history, because uh, to me it really looks like an existential battle between the forces of totalitarianism and the dying old man of the status quo. And really, there has never been a time that where there has been such a threat of an international totalitarianism as today. Not even during the Cold War. I mean, before the age of the internet and all of this modern technology, it really um, limited government's ability to, implement, uh, a wide scale totalitarianism, beyond the borders of um, like a defined country. Like even the Soviet Union, um, despite how far its influence spread, the fact of the matter is that it reached the point of imperial overreach um, before it could really even influence that much of the world compared to the kind of system that you um, see with what I just referred to as global homo earlier. It's a much more comprehensive international system, more comprehensive than we've ever seen before. And if this system turns into totalitarianism, then that could really be a pivotal point in human history. So, if anything, I'd say that Ray Dalio's model is informative of one of the many cycles we live through, which is the currency life cycle, which I don't think is the most important and pressing cycle to be looking at, but it is an important one. So, I will go into an explanation of the currency life cycle. But before I explain the currency life cycle, I have to talk a little bit about human systems in general. So, human systems are basically rules, written or unwritten, that a group of people execute for the purposes of furthering a common goal. So, a country or a state is a system, and it has within it many embedded systems, such as ministries, you got agencies, tribunals, and then even non-governmental actors such as corporations are part of the state system. They interact with the government, uh, and the corporations have their own departments and subdivisions as well. The state itself is embedded within a regional or international order, which is itself one big system of agreements and customs that govern the interactions between different states. Now, one big picture idea that you really have to understand here is that all human systems are programmed to require continued growth. The reason is pretty simple, because any human system that isn't programmed that way will just be replaced by a system that is. The other aspect is that every system reaches diminishing marginal returns. Now, what does that mean? It means that any group of people pursuing a goal will always prioritize the actions that create the most benefit at the least cost. So basically, picking the lowest hanging fruit in terms of allocating resources to invest in its future growth, meaning that over time, those lower hanging fruit are gone, those investments have already been made, and it has to find something else. Eventually, it runs out of ways that it can execute its rules to create sufficient benefit to outweigh the growing costs of maintaining itself. And it can prolong this inevitability by trying to reform itself. But the struggle of every system is having a method of reforming itself that prolongs it as long as possible. But we haven't had any yet. Um, Now, if you ever took political science in university, maybe you heard of um, the McDonald's theory of peace or Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. Basically, this idea that ever since the end of the Cold War, um, it's game over for history. The good guys won, freedom won. Democracy, nothing can stop the path of democracy. And through trade and interconnectedness, we'll never have to go back into a period of global conflict ever again. And the McDonald's peace theory was the idea that um, so when I learned it in university, it was 2013, and it's basically the idea that no two countries that both have McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. I mean, it's kind of debatable whether that was even true back then, because you had wars between Israel and Lebanon. You had different wars between different countries. You had minor conflicts even between countries such as like Russia and Georgia that both had McDonald's. And the big nail in the coffin came in 2020 when Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war. And both of those countries had McDonald's, and at that point, you really can't argue that that wasn't a full war state of war between two countries. But hopefully through this broadcast, and maybe subsequent broadcasts, I'll be able to convince you that we haven't reached that system. I mean, we currently have a full scale war between Russia and Ukraine now, and even though McDonald's has now left Russia, um, it still doesn't. It still, I think is very strong evidence against this idea that, the good guys won and the game is over and it's just going to be smooth sailing and human progress from here. And I think nobody even believes that anymore anyway. Um, I mean, even Francis Fukuyama, the author of the End of History, he himself actually had to correct himself and say that it's not actually the end of history as he just proclaimed it and a win for democracy. But he was making those comments in the context of suggesting that Orange Man bad, threat to democracy. History is come out of retirement because we got to stop the Orange Man from turning us all into fascists. Now, okay, going back to the systems. So, what happens when a big system runs out of benefits that it can generate for itself based on the current rules and the current environment? Well, the smaller systems within that system are still designed to grow, so they will start eating up the other smaller systems within the big system, such that there is a further consolidation of power within the bigger, now stagnant system. Eventually, the writing on the wall is so obvious to those that are doomed to be consumed by this process that they have to fight back by whatever means possible, even if that means risking life and limb. This is the context in which the wealth inequality grows within a stagnant national economy, while old peace turns to fresh war within a stagnant global economy. Now, that's some words on systems, and now I'm gonna try to explain the currency life cycle that I was alluding to earlier. And I think the currency life cycle can be simplified like this. So there's a country, okay? The people in the country need to barter and trade with each other. Eventually, the society becomes too interconnected to be conducting trade in, one-off barter deals or even relationships of repeated deals. So one or a few things become the baseline measure of value to compare everything else against. Usually, this will be something that is either durable or constantly consumed, and something that is pretty consistent so that you can have different amounts of it. So some ancient cultures, and even some modern ones, I think, would use salt as money. You can save salt for a long period of time; it won't go bad, and salt is a necessity for a variety of uses. And historically, it was very critical in food preservation, and we really have an underappreciation for food preservation these days when we have all of these technologies like use of carbon dioxide and chemicals to um, increase the shelf life of food. But for most of human history, that was a very pressing concern, and you can see it in the types of um, traditional meals that you find in different cultures. So let's talk about salt. So Salt is a necessity. You can divide salt into basically whatever amount you want. You can have a cup of salt. You can have a whole truckload of salt. Anything in between. Um, you can't use what would be something else, like you can't use houses as money because you can't really trade anything for one house. It's too big, and you can't really divide it. I guess now, because we have financialization, you could divide the house into different shares and stuff. But you can imagine that in ancient times, you couldn't use anything as a tool of barter. Like, you couldn't use horses as money because horses were just too valuable, and you can't have half of a horse. You'd have to wait until your debt to another person or their debt to you reached the amount of a horse, and then you just have to, I guess, keep tabs on when you would get there. But it would be hard to measure even what is the value um, of a horse over time. Um, like, for example, imagine if I wanted to buy a bag of rice from you. Um, well, I guess you can sell me the bag of rice for 10% of the horse, and then I can call in the horse when it's 100%. But I'm kind of killing my own point here, so I'm just gonna I'm just gonna carry on as if my example was flawless. So eventually, everyone gets sick of having to have all of this heavy salt go back and forth all the time, and what arises is a system of debts where there is some way to keep track of who owes how much salt to whom else. This can be done through ledgers or paper certificates, and you can see how this leads naturally to the idea of a government of a place standardizing these paper certificates. I think the first instance of this happened. There was the ancient cultures in the Fertile Crescent that made use of ledgers to record commerce, and I think the first instance of a paper currency was in one of the ancient Chinese dynasties, where the paper currency was supposed to represent a certain amount of a metal, and then eventually they went off the gold standard and went into money printing and hyperinflation, basically. Um, so you can kind of get a sneak peek of where I'm going with all of this. So uh, not every currency life cycle has to start from salt. Like, usually when one paper currency collapses, it's replaced by like a foreign currency, and sometimes the government just prints more and more money and then starts chopping off zeros, or it could be replaced by some new currency backed by some real commodity like gold or silver. Um, I mean, you could use salt, but it's not as value dense as gold. You're going to need a lot of salt um, being held by the central bank in order to back up the value of the total sum of all the currency that's in circulation. So, um, chopping off zeros. So that's called redenomination, and it happens. It happens very frequently. It's happened a number of times to the Russian ruble. It's happened. I believe it's happened to even the U.S. dollar as well, but I'm not sure about whether it's happened to the dollar. I think they did have periods of devaluation. I'm not sure about redenomination, and then they would, go back to like a new reset it against like a new gold standard or a gold silver hybrid standard. And I can talk about why gold or silver, as opposed to anything else, another time. But basically, the it comes back to those characteristics that I was talking about. You can have gold or silver in any amounts. Um, the key benefit is that it's very, very value dense, and you can um, store silver or gold for a long period of time and it won't go bad. Gold doesn't rust like some other metals do. Um, and there are actual real world need for both gold and silver for a bunch of practical industrial applications. So the Venezuelan government chopped three zeros off of their currency in 2008. So basically, what happened was 1,000 of the original bolivar would be exchanged for one hard bolivar. And then since then, they chopped off more zeros to the point where now they've chopped off 11 more zeros after the three they chopped off in 2008. So now 100 trillion of the new bolivars is equivalent to just one of the original bolivars. And actually, in Venezuela, you can find videos of people in grocery stores buying groceries using little specks of gold that are, just weighing out gold. Prices in the supermarket priced in gold and silver as well. So that's another thing that could happen when a currency, becomes completely unstable and debased. People will revert to other forms of barter, and gold and silver has for millennia been a universal commodity to fall back on in terms of bartering. So why did they have to chop off so many zeros? So the government created so much money that the value of the money went down. I'm sure I could do a whole series of hours on money creation and why it happens, why it basically is always inevitable and why the results are always inevitable. But basically, to stay competitive in an international system, you need to keep growing and selling shit and not falling too far behind. Throughout history, when a government wants to spend more than it can, which always happens, for the purpose of not falling too far behind, by whatever metrics you to which your value judgments lead you, it creates money. But as I'll probably explain in a future broadcast, the creation of money itself can create a greater need for more money creation, setting the path towards an accelerating feedback loop. And it seems manageable until it is eventually and suddenly not. And that's the thing with trends. When you hear people saying, "Oh, something something has always been the case," the Canadian dollar has always been a strong stable currency. Every trend only holds until it doesn't, right? And eventually, every trend goes to shit. Like the sun's gonna die, so um, you know if you are keeping track of solar cycles, which I'll talk about later on, um, those cycles will eventually, come to, they won't follow that cycle forever. No cycle is forever. Now, the current global system is based around the American dollar, which is backed by Saudi oil. It's frequently called the petrodollar. And the price floor for the US dollar is set by the demand created by the fact that the US government demands its use in a variety of situations. Custom demands its use in a variety of situations. The Saudis demand it for their oil. Um, the government requires employers to pay their employees in dollars. It forces their supermarket to sell food in dollars. Forces you to pay taxes in dollars. Um, and that's kind of I don't want to get sidetracked again, but that's kind of the problem with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, is that there isn't that inherent price floor created by that forced demand or backing by some commodity that has some real world industrial application, um, which means that the price is always going to be arbitrary, regardless of what you think of the utility of the technology, for the purposes of making transactions. The fact of the matter is that Bitcoin can never be money because it has no intrinsic value, which means that you can't really price anything in Bitcoin because there's no fundamental basis for it to have any value. But that's a pretty complicated argument to get into. That maybe I'll have someone with a contrary view on, and we can discuss it in a future podcast. But basically, the whole world is one big, complicated, and interconnected system of rules and customs relating to trade that was built on the foundation of the universal demand for oil and the supplying of that demand, since the Industrial Revolution, but more specifically since World War II, when the current world order was basically established. But since the 1970s, the US has had to print more and more dollars at an ever accelerating rate. They even had to come off of the gold standard because of that, actually. And before 1971, August 15, 1971 to be exact, um, the US dollar was pegged to gold at a rate of, I think, $35 to an ounce. So this option wasn't available to the public. I think that window was closed by the big commie Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 30s. But uh, up until the 1970s, different other countries' governments could actually claim their US dollar debts in gold. But basically, um, the government printed too much money, and then this money went overseas, and then people overseas started to realize there was too much dollars going around, so they wanted to trade in their dollars for the gold that the American government promised them as the basis for American dollars becoming the world's reserve currency. Um, and basically, Richard Nixon went on TV in the middle of the night one day, well, not just any day, August 15, 1971, and announced that they were going to temporarily suspend the gold standard to protect the US dollar against what he called speculative attacks. And, you can be the judge of how temporary that was. But, anyways, if you look at the policy rates over time, it goes up and down because the government wants to, in theory, print more money when the economy is bad and print less money when the economy is good. And that's what's called Keynesian economics. But over time, you can see that when it goes up, the highs get lower and lower, which are the points where the economy falls into recession and the government starts printing faster again. And you can also see that when the rate goes down, the lows get lower and lower as well. After the 2008 financial crisis, they put the rate to as low as it could possibly go, basically, meaning that the central bank was printing free money to be borrowed, but that was still not enough to prop up the economy. So they had to do what was called quantitative easing, which is just a fancy term for money printing, easing the quantity of money and inject even more money into the system. Um, the government said that it was a one-time temporary solution, but like I was saying with the gold standard thing, unfortunately, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government solution. And of course, I'm using the term solution very loosely as well, since usually any solution that the government comes up with actually makes the problem more sustained so that the government can seem justified in perpetually continuing to try to solve it and failing to do so. Because if they actually solve the problem, then they have to stop solving it, which means reducing its influence. And like I said, every system is designed to grow itself. And if you look at the money supply of the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, or any other currency these days, you can see that since COVID, governments have been printing simply jaw dropping, astronomical amounts of money. The number of Canadian dollars in circulation today is over $1.6 trillion, whereas it was below $1.1 trillion at the start of 2020. That means that almost half of the dollars in existence have been created since the start of 2020. Oh, no, actually, it means almost a third of the dollars in existence have been created since the start of 2020. The situation's much worse with the US dollar. A lot of the money printing actually started before COVID too, during the 2019 reverse repo crisis. I'll save the explanation for that for another week. Now, where does that put us on the currency cycle? Well, the government printed a metric fuck ton of money under the cover of the COVID lockdowns, and now the whole economy has adjusted itself to the surplus of money, which shows up in the form of higher prices. Today, the official US inflation rate measured by the Consumer Price Index is at 7.9%, and that is February 2021 compared to February 2022. The Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, which should really be called the CPI, is completely rigged because the government pegs some of its obligations to it, such as pension payments or other obligations that are so-called inflation adjusted. The government has the incentive to make the number seem as small as possible. They do this in a number of different ways. The CPI compares the price of a basket of consumer goods from year to year, and sometimes they'll just switch out what goods are included or shift the weighting. For example, house prices rise faster than the other stuff, so they just give housing a much lesser weight than the average person would spend on housing. Then they'll use bogus metrics like what's called homeowners equivalent rent, where they survey homeowners and ask them to um, you know, think of what they would have to pay to rent the house that they own. Like basically their opinion, and use that to measure housing prices. And so you're basically asking someone who doesn't rent to give their opinion of what rent would be for that house, and then using that. It's like letting a kid write their own report card. The government has no incentive to produce anything other than an increasingly more rigged figure. And so there's actually a website called shadowstats.com run by a man named John Williams, who was one of the I believe he was either the main founder or one of the main people who came up with the CPI to begin with, and he basically continues to measure the current inflation using the same CPI metric that they used in 1980 without all of the subsequent rigging that has gone on since then. And it remains consistently more than double the official rate. In fact, using the 1980 CPI throughout the history of the CPI, the current level of inflation, which is almost 20% per year, is worse than anything that has ever been recorded. In 1981, in response to inflation rates reaching the mid-teens, the US central bank at the time raised their policy rate to over 22%. Ronald Reagan appointed a man named Paul Volcker to the head of the Federal Reserve, and basically he really took the task upon himself to make sure that the US dollar was protected. So basically, they raised their policy rates to over 22% to fight what was 14.8% inflation. I think it was in early 1980 or maybe 1981. Now, inflation continued to rise after that. So you had inflation kept going up, reached 15%. They raised the interest rate to 22%. And even under the 22% interest, the inflation actually ended up continuing to rise before peaking, in the upper half of the teens, and then coming back down in a horrible recession as a result of these savage increases in interest rates. Now, I want you to think about this. If the government sets an interest rate that is lower than the inflation rate, then the government is basically paying you to borrow money, because the money that you will owe back, including the interest, will be worth less than the original value that you borrowed. Even with 22% interest rates, the inflation rate continued to increase from 15%. Right now, you have talk about raising interest rates from where they currently are at 0.5% in increments of 0.25% or maybe even 0.5% at a time. But at that rate, inflation is going to continue to run away from us. Whether you believe that inflation is currently at 5% or 15%, it's still increasing, and raising interest rates by 0.25% or even 0.5% at a time, once every 6 weeks, it's like pissing in the ocean. But we also have serious evidence that the economy would crash before the rate could even get to 2.5%. Like, for example, this is what I mean. In September 2019, when that reverse repo market crash happened that I was talking about earlier, the policy rate was at 2.5%. And the economy started falling apart at that rate, which is what the reverse repo crash was. And so they had to print money and lower the rate. You can look this up, but the policy rate was 2.5% as of mid-2019. Then they lowered it a whole 0.75% to 1.75%, and this was before COVID even began. And then once COVID began, they dropped the rate straight down 1.5% down to 0.25%, and started new rounds of quantitative easing, money printing, because 0.25% inflation, 0.25% interest rates wasn't even enough to prop up the economy. And so the interest rate stayed at 0.25% until it was just raised by 0.25% earlier this month. And most people had actually expected the rates to go up by 0.25%, at the first central bank announcements of this year, which I believe was in February, or maybe it was in late January, but the Bank of Canada decided to hold their rate at 0.25%. And, Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, went on and on in this press conference about how even though they didn't raise the rate, because they are, talking about raising rates more seriously than before, That represents, their current, effort at that time in terms of fighting inflation. So inflation is running away, and even if you could raise rates to above 2.5%, you would bankrupt the federal government and all of the provincial governments too, who pointed at the low borrowing rates due to COVID and used that as an excuse to throw all caution to the wind. Now they're all loaded up balls deep in debt, and they can't afford the interest rates to go up too much. I mean, the economy couldn't handle 2.5% interest rates in 2019, more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis. Um, so, after all of this extra government waste and all of these lockdowns and stuff and the horrible shape that our economy's in, and not even talking about the war or all of the climate anomalies and stuff, um, the, even before you talk about all of that stuff, you're looking at the point where the economy starts to crack in terms of interest rates. It's definitely below 2.5%. I would be very, very shocked if we could actually get to 2.5% and stay there, even though you have Scotiabank trying to bluff everyone out of taking variable rate mortgages by saying they expect 11 rate hikes by the end of next year, which would, by the way, get us to all the way up to 3% interest, which, by then, who knows what the inflation rate's going to be. Basically, it's running away from us, and the window of opportunity to actually get this under control without collapsing the economy has fully closed a long time ago. And actually, I take that back, because that window was never open to begin with. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had that reverse repo crash and the lowering of interest rates in September of 2019 before COVID even happened. Now, both federal and provincial governments usually spend around 10 to 15% of their tax revenues on paying the interest on their debt. What happens if borrowing costs have to go up 5x to control inflation? Right now, the interest on a 10-year Canada government bond is about 2.5%, and it's still very conservative to say that this would have to go up to more than 12.5% at least in order to control inflation, which, as I argued earlier, it's already above 15%. But even if you believe that it is 5% or 8% or whatever, it really doesn't matter. The point is that 2.5% interest rates aren't even feasible, and even if you could get there, it wouldn't be strong enough to fight inflation. Now, the thing is, when you 5x the borrowing costs, that 10 to 15% of tax revenues which go to interest payments is actually going to go up much more than 5x, because the government would simultaneously be bringing in much less tax revenue due to the decreased economic activity resulting from the higher interest rates. Basically, the central banks around the world are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Don't do enough to fight inflation and let it run away into hyperinflation, or do enough to fight inflation and basically bankrupt everyone and everything. The systems that keep our society running, and you know how they say money makes the world go round, are in their dying days. We are going to have to either run out of money, or the money will run out of value. We are irreversibly down the path of hyperinflation, but unlike Zimbabwe, we won't have the US dollar to fall back on, because they are on the same path as us, if not much worse. This brings me to the larger civilizational cycles. Systems must grow. In order to grow a society, it needs to consolidate power through a process of centralization and specialization. Different people and groups have different competitive advantages, unless they're exactly the same in every way. If, for example, in 1 hour, I can create 2 burgers or 1 hot dog, but my neighbor who is just better than me can create 5 burgers or 10 hot dogs, then I can focus on just making burgers, and my neighbor can just focus on making hot dogs, and we can come up with a win-win trade, despite the fact that I'm not actually better than my neighbor at anything. In this example, if we trade at 1 burger per 1 hot dog, then I'm getting 2 hot dogs for what it would have taken me to get 1 hot dog, because all I need to do is make 2 burgers and trade them for 2 hot dogs. And my neighbor is getting 2 burgers for what it would have taken him or her to make 1 burger, because they can just make twice as many burgers and trade them at 1-to-1 for hot dogs with me. So in a civilization, the system continues to move towards more centralization and more specialization. The civilization itself is in fact the result of the integration of different systems together. However, all civilizations so far, including this one, has not perfected its methods of reforming itself and transferring power through different individuals and groups over time, and it faces diminishing marginal returns like I talked about earlier. It is inherently designed to fight back harder and harder against the stagnation that this causes, but because, um, I mean, it is because that is a characteristic of the society that allowed it to succeed in the first place. And what I mean by that is once a society reaches diminishing marginal returns, it will fight back harder and harder against stagnation because the fact that it is designed to fight back harder and harder against stagnation is how it got to the point of surviving to see diminishing marginal returns in the first place. So if a society wasn't set up that way, it would basically just get assimilated or exterminated by another society. And even assimilation is basically the death of a group identity. And I think that a group identity, like a nationalism, has its own self-preserving life force, like a collective consciousness. Um, and basically our we can't grow the pie anymore for a variety of reasons. So now we're left to fight over the pieces until there is less and less pie, and eventually there's no pie, or just enough until the pie can actually start growing again. As much as we still have social mobility in this country now, it's definitely a lot less than it used to be when wealth inequality was a much less glaring issue. This is a sign that the system has nearly run its course of power consolidation, so there are less opportunities for us to work together as a society for our mutual benefit. The system will have to start eating itself. It may even have to do with our innate biological traits, too. In this society, we like to think of ourselves as nurture over nature individuals, but we do have some surprising innate characteristics. For example, our fear response to the sight of a snake is actually not a learned behavior, and it can be observed in people who have actually no logical reason to fear it. And there were the mouse utopia experiments of the 1960s, which tried to create an ideal environment for mice, and you can see the fertility rates drop, the antisocial behaviors rise, and the growth inequality of scarce resources continue to grow. You can see the wealth inequality of scarce resources continuing to grow. And since food and water were abundant, the inequality that was growing was in the number of mating partners. So the last civilization to fall under this idea that I'm talking about would be the Roman world order, which happened over a long period of time, obviously. And what's interesting is that when you look at Rome's decline, you can find dropping fertility rates, growing wealth inequality, elites growing increasingly entrenched and out of touch, and the fetishization of the exotic and a corresponding hatred for the civilization's foundational substratum culture, debasement of the currency, growing bureaucracy, the whole 9 yards. It collapsed under its own weight, and it couldn't handle as much weight as we could today because they had much less technology to help them. I think that this also shows, though, that our current civilization could actually collapse much faster because of our increased reliance on technology and systems. Even in the last century, during the Great Depression, people were much more self-sufficient than they are today. Now, if you don't have a constant stream of a whole plethora of different resources, such as diesel, manpower, and the food stuff, urban supermarkets today would be mostly empty in about a week or two. Or even if you just had a trucker strike. Also, when a civilization collapses, it basically has to fall to some sort of base level, kind of like a support level if you're thinking about stocks, or comparing it to stocks. And it has to basically fall to that support level before the decentralization and the despecialization process is sufficiently complete and the state of society is sufficiently poor that things can actually start improving again through a new cycle of centralization and specialization, which couldn't occur before because of the old systems that were so strongly entrenched. So before the Roman world order in the second millennium BC, late second millennium BC, there was the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. And we think of these civilizations, the real ancient Egypt, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Mesopotamians, as being separate civilizations without contextualizing them within their international order. These different societies functioned as one big supersystem, an interconnected system of trade based on extracting and transporting tin, the scarcer metal in the alloy bronze, which was an extremely important resource in that world. Um, Important enough that that period of time is now known to us as the Bronze Age, and the international system at that point was basically centered around extracting tin and transporting it from the periphery of that world, so the faraway lands of Britain and Afghanistan, into the center of that world in the Eastern Mediterranean, where all the action was going on. There are a lot of studies about the Bronze Age collapse, but centuries long power structures crumbled in less than a decade due to a constellation of factors. Climate change reduced food output, and ironworking was discovered as an alternative to bronze. This created migration crises. You can read about the Sea Peoples, who were a diverse group of migrants who invaded everyone in this so called world, who were probably forced to abandon their homes due to reduced food output and the relatively cheaper availability of iron weapons over bronze. This is all very simplified, of course, and there are so many topics here that deserve their own broadcast. But the point is that ripping up the foundation of the international trading order, bronze during the Bronze Age, and the petrodollar during ours, as well as climate change that reduces food output, can quickly destabilize a huge, complicated, and international system of rules and norms and cause allies to become enemies over scarcity. After all, once you have a mega super complicated system like this that's starting to slow to a halt, it is really, really hard to improve um, this complicated system without causing all of these unforeseen negative consequences. And it's really, really easy to make it worse because the natural state of things is towards entropy. It's always going to be easier um, to reduce complexity than to create it. I talked earlier about these cycles of centralization and specialization, and there's always going to be smaller cycles within these grand cycles I've been talking about, which take place over the course of over 1,000 years. It's like kind of looking at a chart for the price of a stock. For example, maybe a stock is going down, but in the context of a correction in the middle of a larger upward trend, um, maybe it's even going down. Maybe it's going down with bumps, bounces along the way, or rallies. Um, so there, you can have smaller, you know, trends within bigger trends that move in the opposite direction of the bigger trend as well. And within this current civilization cycle, we've seen these like smaller cycles repeatedly. You go back 250 years, you get to the American Revolution against British tyranny. You go back 250 more years and you get to the Protestant Reformation against Catholic tyranny. And what is tyranny other than a term for a perceived over-centralization and over-specialization? Both the American Revolution and the Protestant Reformation were in essence decentralization movements. There are century-long cycles too in what is called the Strauss-Howe generational theory as well. Perhaps you've heard of the term the fourth turning. Or maybe you've heard the phrase, hard time creates strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. It's funny because Joe Biden recently actually referred to this theory in a speech that he gave. And I actually wrote the quote down so that I could read it here verbatim. And he said, quote, "We are at an inflection point, I believe, in the world economy. Not just in the world economy, but in the world that occurs every 3 or 4 generations. Now is a time when things are shifting. There is going to be a new world order, and we have got to lead it, and we have got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it." Now, we are at a point in history where it is clear to me that the downtrend of all of these cycles are lining up such that we face acute economic devastation during this decade, then our systems hang on by a thread for a few more decades before falling into a deeper anarchy into the later half of the century, and it'll probably not even hit rock bottom in terms of going down the slow decay until at least the second half of the 22nd century, due to the intergenerational nature of so many of the issues that brought us here, and so many of the issues I hope to talk about in more detail in future broadcasts. Now, speaking of cycles lining up, you can graph cycles of different kinds, not just the ones that I'm talking about here specifically. but any kind of cycles, at least in a simplified form, as some sort of sine wave. So that's too many words. I'm basically saying you can graph any cycle as a sine wave if you're going to simplify it. Now, the sine wave might be going up, it might be going down. In fact, it's probably actually following along a bigger sine wave, which is itself fractally embedded in broader and broader sine waves, which represent bigger and bigger picture trends, going all the way up to the millennium cycle of centralization that I was talking about with the Bronze Age and the Roman Age, and uh, I guess human civilization's only been around for probably like 8 to 12,000 years. So maybe there actually are these huge 10,000 year cycles based on how our societies are organized now, that we just don't have the sample size to be able to identify those patterns. Um, Now, another such cycle that I've been looking at a lot these days is what's called the grand solar cycle. If you want more information about this, you can look up this article by Valentina Zharkova called Modern Grand Solar Minimum Will Lead to Terrestrial Cooling. Now, so I'm going to start with some orthodox knowledge for context before going into the more heterodox idea of this grand solar cycle. So the energy output from the sun is not constant. The sun goes through 11-year periods of increasing output and 11-year periods of decreasing output. The sun also goes through periods of prolonged lower activity across multiple cycles. Historical examples of this are the periods called the Maunder minimum, which happened about 400 years ago, and the Wolf minimum, which happened about 800 years ago, both of which resulted in climate change, which resulted in reduced food output, which resulted in the destabilization of societies. Now, the heterodoxy presented in the article that I'm talking about is as follows. So, the idea that the 22-year cycles are the result of uh, like so the idea is that these 11-year up 11-year down cycles result from the interference pattern of two mostly synchronized but not completely synchronized cycles. And so if you add up these two cycles together, it basically looks like the 11-year up 11-year down with some fluctuations over time. But because these two simultaneous cycles are not synchronized, what happens is that sometimes they go into a destructive interference pattern rather than a constructive interference pattern, leading to a period of weaker solar cycles every 400 years. So, an example of this might be, so let's say you are driving somewhere and you have the left turning indicator on, and you're sitting behind another car that has their left turning indicator on. Now, chances are every car has like a slightly different speed at which the indicator blinks. So when you look at your indicator versus the car in front of you, there will be times where the indicators are blinking together for a while, and then they will slowly get out of sync, and then eventually they'll be going opposite, and then eventually they'll be going the same again. So that's kind of the same idea here. There's these two cycles, um, and it leads to increased and decreased solar activity. And sometimes they, go into, sometimes they're just moving in opposite directions to each other for a while, and it leads to lower activity because of this destructive interference pattern. Now, the idea is that if you look at the known grand minimums over time, and we don't have detailed data on the exact underlying energy levels of the different solar cycles going all the way back, but we do know that the sun went into these periods of lower activity, which screwed up the climate during these other periods. And so if you basically try to extrapolate the trend based on this theory, then the conclusion that you reach is that we are about to go into a period of several decades where the sun is transitioning in and then out of this state of reduced activity. Not only will this lower the Earth's temperature, but the transition itself will destabilize weather patterns and make the climate more unpredictable, which will lead to crop failures and, in any case, reduced food output. It could also lead to a period of greater seismic and volcanic activity. Now, what you'll notice if you go back for the last couple of years is that um, the number of anomalous weather patterns and their impact on crop production has actually been increasing at an alarming, accelerating rate for the last couple of years, predating COVID. You had basically what they would call once in a decade floods in China in 2019, and then once in a century floods in 2020, and then once in a millennium floods in 2021. Um, they had huge crop destroying floods in Australia this year. Um, if you look at North America, there's been um, every year there is a bigger increase in the amount of wildfires and just general dry drought conditions. If you look up the news from last year, food production in Canada was um, really hurt last year by what they called the drought, um, and maybe we like to think of these as one-off events, but if something is getting worse over 3 years in a row, then that starts to look like a trend. And if you extrapolate that trend, even if you don't consider the war, which could actually be an effect of this trend actually, um, then even without the war, that you have um, an outlook for increasingly decreasing food production. That was a bad way to say it. You have a outlook that shows decreasing food production. Okay. Um, Now, if this trend sustained over 3-4 years, no war, no inflation, no nothing else, we'd basically pretty much be fucked because the world currently runs on an average of 90-day food supply. And like I was saying earlier, supermarkets need to be restocked like every week, more than every week. Um, so we really have been seeing the drawbacks of this just-in-time, over-optimized, over-specialized, over-centralized economy in the form of these supply chain issues that were caused by the COVID lockdowns. So a sane society that sees these patterns coming would would gear itself in advance to be able to um, manage social unrest as a result of um, lifestyle changes that are inevitable when you decrease the output of the sun that we need for photosynthesis for the bottom of our food chain, um, and actually starting to shift society to be geared towards more food production, a process that actually takes a lot of time and reorganizing of the economy, which if you want to do properly, you have to do through um, minimally interfering incentive structures rather than um, micromanagement by government, which can't manage, which could the government couldn't manage itself out of a cardboard box, its way out of a cardboard box. But if you look at countries like Russia and China, which were pretty early in banning their fertilizer exports and spent all of the last couple of years hoarding all of the gold and grains and other commodity supplies that they could possibly get their hands on, um, it makes you wonder if maybe the underdogs in this world order have a clearer view of the problems with this world order and where it's headed, and are better positioned to adapt to those changes. So maybe we can look at them and learn a thing or two about what adaptations we might make for ourselves. Not at the country level, since everybody is pretty much lost their minds, but those of us who are sane to get together and position ourselves so that at least those of us that can see this problem coming can help each other prepare for it because the kinds of troubles that I'm seeing for our society in the next 200 years, there is no way that any family could brave this alone. So that pretty much brings me to an end of an hour, pretty much exactly. So I'll have to get into each of these topics in future broadcasts. I know I was stammering a lot today. Um, it's kind of weird talking for a whole hour by yourself at a computer with just basic notes. I've never really done it before. Um, so I guess it's good that I took these next couple of weeks as practice rounds to just, I guess, even just make myself more used to this kind of communication format, even for myself. So I actually have a friend who is expecting to move to Toronto sometime, maybe next month or maybe maybe later, and we'll probably host this show together. And maybe I'll sound a little more natural, maybe if I have somebody to actually talk to and bounce my ideas off of. And maybe it'll be more interesting to listen to as well. I haven't actually um, listened to this podcast, listened to this broadcast, obviously, because I am still currently recording it. But hopefully, it's not too hard to follow. Hopefully, it makes sense. And hopefully, you learned something or at least reinforced your very correct pre existing opinions. Okay, so I'll see everybody next week. Bye.